All right. Well, yeah, without further ado, Joe Gray, Social Engineering Your Metrics. Um, Very cool, I think, underrepresented one. I remember telling Joe when I was looking at an early version of this, I've seen a lot of metric talks and a lot of them just don't get into enough detail, enough examples and stuff like that. So it's good to have one of these. And metrics in general is just one of those things that doesn't sound very sexy to talk about, but you get in a situation where you need them, and boy, is it important. So I'll leave it to you, Joe. Take it away.
Thank you very much, Adrian. So um, here's me, my office. So I'm Joe Gray. You all didn't take time out of your day to look at my ugly face, so we're going to go ahead and get into the slides. So welcome to Social Engineering Your Metrics. Basically, this is kind of a derivative of one of the chapters of my upcoming book. When I was writing the defensive portion of the book, talking about ways to integrate with incident response, to find ways to have better awareness programs, I was brainstorming and it came to me, we should talk about some metrics. And I didn't want to reinvent the wheel, but at the same time, I wanted to provide something that would kind of disrupt things and actually have a change for the good. So about me by day, I'm a senior OSINT specialist at Complex. I served in the Navy on submarines. Not going to read everything on this. Of course, shameless promotion for the book. It's due out October 13th. It is available for pre-order on Amazon. That is a redirect link that will take you there. I used to write for Forbes. Now I write for whomever I feel like it right now. The competitive side of me from OSINT and social engineering, kind of where I got my basis from. I'm the 2017 DerbyCon Social Engineering Capture the Flag winner, the runner-up of the 2019 Hackfest in Quebec City Social Engineering Capture the Flag. I can't stress how important the phrase "parlez-vous anglais" was that day. And then I've competed in quite a few OSINT CTFs and missing persons CTFs, notably getting 4th place at the DerbyCon OSINT CTF last year, 5th place in the most recent Trace Labs missing persons CTF, and 2nd place in the Trace Labs missing persons CTF at Hackfest, the same one I was competing in the social engineering stuff with. I'm not a lawyer, but here's the disclaimer. So the thoughts and opinions are mine alone, not those of any of my employers, past, present, or future. So to break into this and get in line with the objectives, I want to talk about current general metrics and social engineering specific metrics. The problem with that, I'm going to introduce some new metrics, a little bit about analysis models, and some potential for future integration. So with that being said, current InfoSec metrics that we have in general, we have metrics about passwords, things like these are the most common passwords. Here's the common time to crack this list of passwords. Here's the complexity of such and such password. On average, X percentage of people within an organization have their email address, password, phone number, or something in a data breach. And then getting into the vendor world, we have response metrics. So that comes into things like service level agreements between organizations and managed security providers. But then it also gets into other terms of responses, such as internal things that could be used in performance evaluations and what have you. Then we have what I call the vendor's favorite metric, and that's dwell time, especially when we're talking about vendors selling malware protection or something along those lines. So dwell time, basically the time from compromise until they actually decide to do something. And then while it's not specifically a metric per se, return on investment is a pretty common theme that is metric-ish or metric adjacent, if you will. So going into social engineering, especially like phishing, we have opens, clicks, credentials stolen, and then we might have averages or a ratio of opens, clicks, stolen credentials. So how many people opened the email, how many people clicked on the email, how many people input stuff on a form. You can convert this over to vishing by how many people kept you on a call for a certain amount of time, how much time was the average phone call, based on the predefined things you were trying to collect, how many of those did you collect on average? And then regarding ratios, it could be the number of opens as opposed to the number of people it was sent to, the number of opens in contrast to how many people clicked on it, or how many people opened it and you stole creds from. A lot of different ways you can go about that. But I mean, getting into the meat and potatoes of it, we have to ask, what's the problem with this? And I'll just summarize this on a single slide, and that's, these metrics really don't measure much. Basically, they're just measuring something so that we can say we did better on this metric that has no application than we did the last time. So we must be doing better. That's one of those things that I like to call digital melatonin. It's one of those things that helps execs sleep at night. And I mean, there's nothing wrong with some level of digital melatonin, but at the same time, we don't want to get too wrapped up in that. If I'm providing someone metrics, I want to provide them something that is actionable, something that they can work with. I really I hate using the SMART acronym, but specific, measurable, attainable, realistic, and timely. That's something I would look for in a metric. So the logic behind that statement that they really don't measure much, let's face it, emails are meant to be open. And we have a lot of training platforms, and they don't really have anything for link detonation. You might be able to input your own links in there, but it's not really going to test anything. And the links are usually really strange. And then, you know, a lot of non-tech folks, they use the same password everywhere, or they may use some variant of that. For example, a friend of mine reached out. They had received one of those emails claiming that it had turned their webcam on and observed them doing explicit stuff, and they were going to release the video unless they paid them $200 in Bitcoin. The password they cited had not been used in about 5 years. The one that was cited in the email, but it was literally the person's child's name and the year that they were born. So that's a very common thing. And it ended up being an 8-character password. So in some compliance schemes, that's fully compliant, even though it was all lowercase and just numbers, 2 of the 4 typefaces. The point with that being that, what if someone required a 9-character password? Well, that person probably would have added an exclamation point to it or something to that effect. But let's dig into these bullets again. So regarding emails and the fact they're meant to be open, a good fish should not set off any alarms with the subject line or the sender of the email. The text of a well-constructed fish should raise some eyebrows, but not immediately set off alarms. And that's assuming you're using something like Outlook that has a preview pane. And then the other thing is the training platforms. A lot of that stuff is predicated on the assumption that the organization is going to have a training program that actually employs, that has something that actually engage the users and they actually care about. Oftentimes it's like, oh gosh, security's in my inbox again. I've got to do this stupid training. I'm going to have to work extra today to finish my defined workload because I've got this deadline or something. And I mean, conventional wisdom says, oh, if it's HTTPS, it's safe. If it has a green padlock, it's safe. That's not the case anymore. And then, of course, we have human nature that deals with various types of curiosity. No matter what you do, no matter how you train people, there's always going to be someone that's going to either fall for it because they're naive, or they're going to fall for it because they're curious, or because they don't care. So, and if you want any evidence regarding things about non-tech people using the same password or variants, you can't get that from Have I Been Pwned, but what you can find out from Have I Been Pwned would be a bunch of the data breaches that a particular email address has been in. There are other resources like Dehashed or Scylla. Scylla is not commercially online right now, so you have to know somebody to get into that. But basically you could query an email address in one of those platforms. And there are others out there. There used to be one called Leaked Source, but every time a new leaked source pops up, the feds shut it down in a relative short amount of time. But anyway, you could query an email address and see that variation. So what am I getting at? Well, I mean, let's deconstruct how these things that we care about affect us. So if we care about opens, what we're telling users is that we are going to punish them for opening emails. And if we've got someone who's naive, or we've got someone who's problematic, maybe not very productive or something to that effect, they may use that to avoid work. Oh, I'm sorry, that email looked like a fish, so I didn't open it. Or if you have an email address that you ask your users to send emails to, you may get flooded with legitimate emails. And in the initial learning phases, that's fine. But when you've got an employee who's been with your organization for months or years, who's been in the training program for weeks, months, or years, that is still sending emails that they know to be authentic as phishing emails, then obviously there's a problem there. And opens, yes, I understand in some cases there are some types of malware that when you open it, it will execute. I understand that, and I'll address that in a moment. But caring about how many people open an email, that doesn't accurately measure risk. It measures some level of risk, but I've got more on that a little bit later. So worrying about clicks, I will admit that clicks are more relevant than opens. It does test the human, but at the same time, this is the point I was getting at from the previous slide, building defense in depth should be built in such a way that it allows for users to make a mistake without causing a fatal error for your entire organization. If your security architecture is built in such a way that one single user clicking on one single fish that has one single piece of malware can take the entire organization down completely, you need to rethink your security priorities. That being said, if you have the defense in depth and you have mitigating factors, because at the end of the day, I like to reference Win Schwartau's book, Time-Based Security. And basically the TLDR of that book is that we don't need to build security that's 100% absolute. We don't want to build things that's going to protect us forever, because as we saw in Alyssa's presentation before this, it's a constant moving target. It's a continuous game of cat and mouse. So that being said, we need to build our security defenses up in such a way that they will defend long enough for us to detect that something is wrong and take remediation steps and actions to mitigate the problem. And the same should exist for clicking on links. There should be, anytime that you're doing things like this and you're running with malware or malware simulation or something to this effect, this should be a test of your technical controls in addition to the people. And honestly, a lot of managers miss that point. A lot of people get really passionate about pointing the finger at users, calling them stupid, punishing them with more training. And don't get me wrong, if a user falls victim, yes, they need to be retrained. They need some sort of remediation, but humiliation and hardcore punitive actions, threatening their job or their livelihood, that's not the way to go about it. And that falls under the theory of bees with honey instead of vinegar. So looking at stolen credentials, you know, this is also, this fails to face the reality that it's predicated on having a password policy. And what I mean by that is, if you're requiring people to change their passwords, depending on which compliance framework you're in, or whatever your defined interval is based on your organization, it could be 30, 60, 90, 180 days. It could be 365 days. You may not ever have to change the password policy. But what I'm getting at with that is, okay, if my password was Nick 1999, that's only good for up to 89 days if all passwords are changed every 90 days. But because password reuse is so prevalent, then that causes issues, because even if I captured Nick 1999, your next password might be Nick 1999 exclamation point. Then the next one might be with the @ symbol. And there are ways to go about this. And that's why I really try to hammer home with that final bullet. It's mitigated with things like multi-factor authentication and password managers. Of course, someone has to know the password to their password manager. They have to have access to whatever method of out-of-band communication you are using for multi-factor authentication. But the thing about it is, if you're using a password manager, it's a lot easier to advocate to the users to use a unique password for every single website, because it's absolutely transparent to them. They don't care. And then so what if you enforce a password change every 30 days, even if you wanted to go that far? I think that's a little extreme, but if you wanted to go that far, so what? It's literally them going into a form, clicking a button in their browser, updating their database, and going on about their day. And then if they have their password manager on their phone, it syncs there too. So it's not the end of the world. So with that being said, you can care a lot less about stolen credentials with the use of password managers, assuming, and this is based on a large assumption, that users are creating and using unique passwords that are complex for every single resource that they use. So the TLDR of that is, organizations do try to put the burden entirely on non-technical employees. I don't expect Betty in HR to be a security guru, just as she should not expect me to know the laws around working in human resources in the state of Tennessee. I don't have an MBA because I'm no good at accounting. So therefore, Melissa in accounting cannot expect me to do her job, nor should I expect her to understand everything about security. But just as I have to adhere to the processes that we use to submit our expenses and things for repayment, and I have to have that limited working knowledge of the accounting process, Melissa should also have that limited working knowledge of my discipline of security to understand, hey, you know, this looks a little fishy. I have some questions about this. Who do I reach out to? And then, of course, some managers, executives, and professionals within the industry, they fail to see that technology is not an end-all be-all solution. It can help mitigate the problem, but it's not going to completely solve the problem. As long as you don't care about availability, the only way to solve the problem is to completely disconnect all power sources. But then why are we doing this? And then with companies, they fail to admit their own shortcomings. They're like, well, you know, we paid for this random training that was made 6 years ago that still doesn't address all these other things. Well, you can't. Betty in HR can't make that happen. That's got to be a decision from the top. And a lot of, I'm not saying all, but a lot of organizations fail to pick up on that and get meaningful use of it. I mean, one of the hardest things about being a consultant back when I was in consulting was basically telling companies that their baby was ugly. And what I meant by that was, you think your security posture is great. Well, you didn't think about all of these things, and here are some additional things to think about. I mean, I didn't legitimately go and tell people their babies were ugly, but proverbially speaking, yeah. So getting into the metrics that matter. So we've got open to click ratio. That's kind of one that we've looked at before as a traditional metric, but it actually has some teeth to it. Open to action. That action could be forwarding, that could be inputting data, that could be downloading a file with a macro in it, that could be responding. Whatever the action is, you can define that for each individual part of the engagement. The third one is the one that is the most important in my opinion. I don't care, as a security practitioner, I don't care if someone within my organization clicks an email and the email has an exploit kit that's trying to drop ransomware on my network. I care that the exploit kit's there. What I care most about is that the employee reports it to me so I have ample time to take action. If nothing else, create a rule within the routing equipment that would prevent that host from communicating with any other host. So basically putting it in a rubber room, disconnecting power, removing it from the network, restoring from known good media, all those things that we always hear about. But if it's not reported to me, I don't get that head start. I have no opportunity to take action. And then the same things for reporting. So, or I'm sorry, for clicking. So click to action. So how long from the time you click an email until you input something in the form? From the time someone clicks an email, what is the time between the first click of an email and the time it is reported? And then you can even go and say on a per user basis, what is the average time between the time someone clicks on an email and reports it? And then, oh man, I didn't mean to do that. I totally input information on this form that I shouldn't have. I need to report it. That's a very valuable metric as well. And then accidentally duplicated that slide. So the click metrics, again, click to action. We went through that, the click to reporting. At the end of the day, I want to know, hey, I did something wrong. Okay, cool. You did the right thing. You're gonna have to do some extra training, but all is good in the world. Trigger incident response. Do whatever we need to do. So here's the other one that's very important, and these are the distance measures. And I got ahead of myself and kind of talked about them before, but open to action. That is the time, and I'm working on a script right now that will automate this. It's not done. I can't show you anything because it's not even close yet. But basically, measuring the difference in time using epoch time. So measuring the time in seconds from the time a user opens an email until they perform an action. Same thing with click. And again, we can do that on a per user basis or as an organization as a whole, the time from the first click until the report, something to that effect. And then the same thing for, we have it for the actions, we have it for reporting, and then the action to report. What is the distance within that time? How many people, going back to the ratio measurement with action to reporting, we had 12 people, I'm sorry, we had 10 people click on it, but only one reported. So we would, in that case, we would say we have a 10% reporting ratio. Very simple math with that. And I try to keep the math as simple as possible with this. We're not going to be looking at equations. Don't worry, we're not going to have anything from any of those movies. But the distance measurement, basically, we ultimately do want to avoid an incident altogether, but we also want to be notified. We don't want to be notified by Brian Krebs, the FBI, or whatever else. There's a reference to Win Schwartau's book. Again, focus on the defenses, and then how much lead time do you have to enact incident response? That's really the absolute meat and potatoes of what I'm going for with this. So from that lens, I alluded to this before, but what if you are a consultant? Well, I mean, you can provide even more value. I mean, how do you think organizations like Symantec and Verizon come up with, and the Anti-Phish Work Group come up with things like the ISTR, the DBIR, and the phishing report of the year? Well, it's because they have member organizations that collect metrics and submit them. But if you work as a consultant and you have several clients, you can do this on a per engagement basis and a population basis. The population basis is going to be all clients. The per engagement can be per phishing engagement or per client. So nevertheless, so the slice metric, that would be all phishing engagements across all clients, client only. Of course, you're going to have to anonymize some data. You don't want to release anything about an organization, but the ratios themselves, you can say on aggregate, our customers tend to have a 42% reporting rate as it relates to clicks. They have a a 19% reporting rate for email opens and a 63% reporting rate for having input information into forms. So that's something you can provide and say, okay, based on this information, your team is really good at reporting after they've done something wrong. They're marginal at reporting something after they've clicked on it and they've realized it's bad. They're not doing so good at identifying these emails as they open them. So with that one, it being the subject line, there's not a whole lot you can do with that. But you can, there are ways you can go about things. Things like proof point, for example, that will prepend or append the word external or whatever you choose before or after the subject of an email. That's always an option as well. But anyway, you have access to this data. And of course, you would have to look at your consulting contracts with clients and verify the verbiage with that. But if you're using anonymized data, then you can say, hey, here's some value. We did 319 phishing engagements last year. Here are the statistics. You can provide it to the client exclusively for client only. Across all of our phishing engagements, here's what we have. And then you want to include phishing, here's those as well. So, and as we get into that, we're going to deal with a little bit of the statistic analysis. And this is probably the part that's going to make some eyes glaze over. I'm not going to get too deep into it, but basically we have the mean, which is the average. That's basically the central tendency. And the equation for that is the sum, basically every value added together, divided by the number of values. We have the median, that's going to be the centermost value in your data set. And then we have standard deviation. And that's the amount of variance between data points within the data set. Regarding that, a very high standard deviation is going to show a lot of variation between your data points. Lower standard deviation will indicate that they are grouped very similar. And whenever you're assessing what is high and what is low, that's going to be based on what values your data has. So with that being said, when you're dealing with the statistic methods, depending on how many data points you have, like for example, if you're a consultant and you're doing a phishing engagement against an organization that only has 8 employees, you may be able to do quantitative and qualitative. So the qualitative and the quantitative. Quantitative is assigning a firm numeric value to each level. Qualitative is like high, medium, low, good, average, bad, something to that effect. And in some cases, there are some things like, for example, phishing. If you're talking about activities on phone calls, that could actually call for a mixed method. And the reason I say that is mixed method is you could measure the overall sentiment of the phone calls. A lot of them were positive, a couple were neutral, and one was negative. Okay, those qualitative properties would be qualitative, but then you can still measure, okay, this is the number of times I called, or here's the number of times I called, here's the amount of time I averaged on each call, here's the time I was on each call. Did you receive any reports? And that does require the client security team to provide you some forms of information. But with that, that would be mixed method. And that's just kind of getting into the data science part. But the challenges that rely on this, if you want to do, like if we wanted to apply like big data science, basically, the only thing I've got on this slide is regression, which is similar to standard deviation. It takes a very large data set and it compares each value to each other value in mass. That's how organizations find out who the best person to market to is. That's a very common use case for regression. And regarding regression, you have to have a very large data set for it. When I was taking a data science course in college, I one of my assignments required me to do regression and actually figure out who the best person to market to was. I had 10,000 unique rows, and I think it was 150 columns. I don't remember the exact number, but nevertheless, and each thing had been quantified. So that was a data set that was good enough to get something from. If you only have 8 people, you're not going to be able to perform that. It's just not possible. Another thing would be cluster analysis, which is basically doing comparative regression. That is something that is very similar to what we might call A/B testing. So getting into the practical application of this. Well, how would we do this? Well, like I said, I'm working on a script that would actually assist with parts of this. And we would have to integrate it with your SIM or syslog or Windows logs or whatever. You might have to have some integration with the ticketing system if that's your main method of reporting things. And then, of course, measure distance and difference between things using epoch time. Like I said, I'm working on it, but I've not got it finished. The other thing that you could do with this is actually input a list and say, here are the internal non-routable IP addresses and the users associated with them, so that we can measure based on the tracking pixel, if you decide to use that in a fish, or any other quantitative method to see who actually input information and who clicked the window. Just an ethical sidebar associated with it would be, I wouldn't share the information that was input by the users, just because I can't guarantee that it wouldn't be misused. I would just give a yes, no. They input, they didn't. So if we want to integrate this with data science, I talked about cluster analysis. We could do some level of A/B testing with this, which would be, you potentially send 2 different types of phishing emails to 2 defined groups to test how they respond to things, so that you can adjust your training based on the differences between those 2 emails. Could be differences in the links, differences in the verbiage, differences in the landing page, the delivery. It could be time of day, so many variables with that. And then we can bring in other things like recurrent neural networks and long short-term memory models, which are even more advanced data science concepts. So in conclusion, you don't have to have a doctorate in data science to be able to meddle with this. To be like really, really, really good to the point where you feel comfortable selling it, yeah, probably. I'm not trying to sell anything with this. I just like the idea of the metrics. I guess in hindsight, I might be trying to sell the book, but that's not the ultimate end game. That also being said, though, ultimately using these data points and metrics, that allows us to actually provide value to our organization and adjacent organizations, whether it be our customers, partners, or whomever, via the additional security. So that's always a part of it as well. And then also, as with anything, whether it be malware protection, AppSec, whatever, there's snake oil, especially when you're dealing with sales and product teams. And then just keep in mind, and this is a very important concept, statistics can be manipulated in various ways for ill gain. So depending on how you frame the information, depending on how you normalize and stem the data set, that can affect the way that it is perceived, as well as the way you visualize it can have that same impact. So for example, putting something on a scale from 0 to 100, when the highest value is, we'll say 14, that's going to make things look very small, and that's just part of the human nature. But if we put it on a scale from 0 to 20 or 0 to 50, it's going to look more significant for that reason. So keeping in mind the way that we visualize the data, that's important as well. But visualization is not a necessary component of that. So we'll go ahead and start taking questions. In the meantime, I'm going to share some additional slides with you as well. I've got some upcoming training events online. They're all pure virtual. There's short links to get to all of them. I've got coupon codes. The 15% off coupon codes, that also gets a 15% donation to the organization associated with it. So Trace Labs, Women of Security, or Operation Safe Escape. I also created a coupon code for 25% off for BSides Knoxville. So there's those coupon codes. I've got the basic OSINT course coming up and the regular expressions course. The basic OSINT course is business OSINT oriented. The regular expressions course deals with Python-based regular expressions and some decent sized data sets. I've also got another missing persons OSINT course coming up, as well as an OPSEC for OSINT and privacy course. Same thing with all those coupon codes. In cooperation with Workshop Con as part of the Layer 8 conference, I will be giving a full day OSINT crash course. There's the registration link for that. There's a coupon code in the works. It's just not happened yet. There's the short link to it, and I did not set the price on that, so I don't have very much control over it. You may or may not be aware, but No Starch has donated 2 book vouchers to give away today. They've also given us a coupon code for 20% all books. There are the instructions to do so. I've also posted the instructions in the Discord server, and it's in a couple of slides. I am going to be sharing my slides, so this will be on Sched as well. If you want to attend a free virtual conference, it was going to be in Atlanta, but it's not anymore. It's virtual. October 22nd and 23rd, there's Hacker Halted. So information with that. That being said, we've got a few minutes, so any questions?
Let's see. Don't have any in the go to webinar. Let's check track 1 here. We were sharing some memes in the in track 1. You know, the Orange County Choppers one, where he's like, "What do you mean I didn't pass the phishing test?"
It's always a good one.
Yeah, it's like, why security saying, "Why are you clicking this stuff?" You know, and the dad says, "If you're so smart, why don't you block those emails in the first place?"
I mean,
it's my favorite.
I mean, being honest, I submitted that meme to the Maury Povich show, and his test came back that that is not a lie.
Nice. So tips for thinking about useful metrics is a question that we've got.
So you've got to think about in regards to what it is you're trying to achieve, what it is you're trying to learn from it, and how you're going to go about it. So basically, is the juice worth the squeeze? Is the reward worth the lift? So if you're coming at it from a consulting sense, you need to collaborate with your client and say, hey, if you're trying to get distance metrics, especially as it relates to reporting, I need to know the exact time that someone reported this, because you're going to know the exact time you sent the email, because obviously you're the one doing the phishing, so that you can convert both of those times to epoch time and measure it in seconds. And then if you want to compare it, you can move that to minutes and hours. That's a matter of dividing by 60 or 3,600 if you want to go directly to hours. Regarding the ratios, same thing. You will be able to tell partially a ratio of how many people clicked it versus how many people input information, if that's the route you went. The problem with that is, unless you host the phishing server internally, you are only going to see the organization's NAT address, network address translation. So it's going to be their public address. So that's another opportunity that you're going to have to collaborate with the internal security team to be able to get access to those logs and parse it and break it down that way. Does that answer your question?
It was on, the question was on Discord, so be a good place to jump in later on after we wrap up here.
Indeed.
Yeah. Yeah, so it sounds like a common problem is like people are expected to record metrics, but just so many of them are just worthless. Like they don't really mean much of anything.
Right. And I mean, I look at this from two perspectives. One, I want to collect all the metrics because there may be a way that we can eventually figure out how to, I'm just going to use the example of cure world hunger with this, right?
Right.
We might be able to figure that part out. But at the same time, even if we can't solve that problem, we may be able to find some trends that we can build better defenses with. But at the
Sure.
same time, I don't want to spend all of the time creating these metrics, doing the analysis, doing all this and that, if nothing's ever going to change. And I kind of think that's where a lot of the world is today, because people, we have a negative unemployment rate, well, prior to COVID, and we have people who are significantly overworked that don't have the time to implement a lot of things. And that plays into it as well. And that leads to general frustration about anything, though.
And yeah, we get feedback that you did answer that first question.
Perfect.
Did you want to talk about no starch?
Yeah, I put the slide up. Here, I'll bring it back in. There's the no starch stuff. So again, 20% off their books. There's the redemption instructions. It's valid until May 15th. Show No Starch lots of love because full disclosure, they are my publisher.
Cool. So the Secure Code Warrior Championship is done. And thank you very much, Joe, for that. That was a great presentation. Again, lots of good conversation in the channels.